I spent the first 18 years of my life raised by a single mom living in low income, government subsidized public housing projects. I'm 39 now and haven't lived in those conditions for over 2 decades, but I spent my childhood as poor as you could be as an American youth. And I've learned to describe the poverty I grew up in that way, American youth, because one, I always had a roof over my head, and if things got really bad and we were evicted from the projects, I'd become a ward of the state and be cycled around the foster care system. Now, I'm not saying the foster care system is good or bad. It certainly has some bad points, but it has also changed the lives of many children who would otherwise become in really bad places. But in America, I legally couldn't end up homeless unless I ran away or something like that. And as far as I'm concerned, being homeless is the poorest you can be. Secondly, I've seen what being poor is like in places like Mexico, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic. Once on a volunteer trip to Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic, I did some work in a neighborhood where the houses didn't even have floors. They were just made of mud made of dirt that would turn into mud during a heavy rainstorm. I've ridden through the massive shanty towns outside of Mexico City where there is no plumbing or electricity, just buildings made of standing sheet metal and kids playing soccer on the concrete like some true gangsters. America gets a lot of flack for the wealth disparity, but you don't realize how bad it could be until you visit a few places where the GDP isn't quite so high. Still, growing up in government subsidized public housing projects ain't no picnic either. We were on food stamps. We relied on the food bank, the Salvation Army, and the free lunch and breakfast at school to feed us. And when school was out during the summer, my mom put us in these camps that were funded by HUD and the Housing Authority so we still could get 2 meals a day. It was just my sister and my mom, but at any given time, we had between 2 and 7 relatives living with us. And I've been working since I was 11 to make sure I had money to at least get a bus pass or buy myself shoes more than once a year. We faced a few evictions, but we never ended up on the street because if you get evicted from the projects, there ain't really much place else for you to go. And the phone did get shut off a few times. I tell you all this so you know that I know what being poor is actually like. I found that when most people talk about growing up poor, they just mean they weren't rich, or in some cases, that their parents had low paying manual labor jobs. I'm not here to have a whose upbringing was rough or contest. Everyone's bad was hard for them because that's all they've known. But I'm also not going to pretend that having 2 working parents, a car, and being able to afford unsubsidized rent or a mortgage is the same level as not being able to eat or afford a place to live without government assistance. I grew up in the Terrace Village housing projects, and when those were demolished, I moved to the Northview Heights housing projects. Anyone who knows the Pittsburgh area can vouch in the comments that these are the roughest, most dangerous, poorest areas of the city, and I lived this way until I was 18. And then my dad died during my senior year. Now, my dad wasn't part of my life. I knew who he was and I talked to him on the phone sometimes, but he moved out of town, so I only saw him a few hours a year when he came back to kick it with his friends, and never to explicitly visit his children. But I guess he had a soft spot in his heart for us because despite not really being a presence in our life, I got $55,000 in life insurance money along with some money from Social Security since I was a minor the year he died. All total, I think I pocketed like $60K for my dad's death for that summer. This was May 2003. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know the stress of poverty. However, that would soon change. By August 2004, only 15 months later, I had not only blown through it all, but I was purposely overdrawing my bank account so I could have some money for food. I went to the ATM and just kept withdrawing money until they wouldn't let me anymore. I made off with like $400 in money that I didn't really have. In the following years after that, as I worked minimum wage customer service jobs, slept on my aunt's floor because moving home with my dysfunctional ass mom was out of the question, but that's a story for another video. And using the old walk around the grocery store while eating food that I didn't buy and leaving before I could pay for it trick, I thought long and hard about how I blew that money. I didn't travel or buy anything extravagant. I hadn't even become a full-blown alcoholic yet. I wouldn't get the complete answer to this question for almost 20 years when my mom died. Before I get to that, let me ask you a question. Which comes first, poverty or poor decisions? Let me put it to you another way. Does being poor cause you to make bad decisions that keep you poor, or do you make bad decisions that lead you to lose your money? If you're like most people, you probably think it's the latter. You probably thought something like, stop wasting all your money on Jordans, video games, and weed, or the more gentrified version, stop buying lattes and eating out, and you'd have more money to invest. And look, these ideas have a lot of truth to them. Let's say I do something dumb like catch a DUI charge. I'm going to lose my car, which means I probably can't get to work, and that's if I still have a job in the first place. I'll have to pay all types of fines, restitutions, attorney and court fees, and towing and storage fees for my car. The court is even going to make me pay for that thing you have to breathe into to start your car only if you blow below a certain blood alcohol level. And that's assuming I don't go to jail and have to post bail. And because I know someone is going to miss the point, let me clarify. These aren't the worst parts of getting a DUI. That would be ruining someone else's life. I'm just pointing out how dumb decisions can put you in the poorhouse. And if you're one of those people making dumb decisions like driving under the influence, check out my videos on how I got sober and the worst decisions men can make. I'll put both of them in the description. So getting back on track. Yes, you can do one big dumb thing that puts you in the poorhouse and keeps you there for years, or you can do a series of little dumb things that ensure you never get ahead of your bills. However, when I was writing my next book and memoir, Hard Lessons from the Hurt Business, Boxing, and the Art of Life, pre-order link in the description, I realized that there's a lot of truth in the idea that growing up poor can cause you to make terrible decisions, many of which will guarantee that you'll always be fighting an uphill battle with your finances. Growing up poor makes you more likely to be poor. While this feels intuitively accurate, why does it work that way? It's only been recently that this connection has been measured and verified. In 2016, a team of Stanford economists confirmed that the lower your household income is growing up, the less money you're likely to make at age 30. When you grow up in poverty, there are, by definition, no examples of healthy financial habits around you. You don't grow up with any financial sense because you never saw anyone around you with financial sense. So, if you grow up in low-income public housing surrounded by people who lack the resources to get out of the projects, and the person you spend the most time around, the one who is raising you, has repeatedly demonstrated zero financial sense, then you're already set up for financial failure. But that's not even the worst part. A 2013 Princeton study found that when low-income people are under financial stress, they score worse on tests of IQ and logical reasoning. Their IQs appear to drop by about 13 points. To put that drop in perspective, the average range of IQ is 85 to 115. For someone on the tail end at 85, lower but still average and fully capable of contributing to society and living without assistance, a 13-point drop would take their IQ from 85 to 72, putting them in the same category as someone who meets the clinical diagnosis of mental, that R word I'm not going to say because YouTube hates it, even if it's used in the proper context, but you all know what I mean. A 13-point IQ drop is bigger than what's experienced by people suffering from dementia. And there will be a link to this study and the other studies I reference in the description, so you know I'm not talking about my ass. The stress of poverty makes you more likely to do things that exacerbate your poverty and do less of the things that would alleviate it. And yet, it still gets even worse. Have you ever wondered how it's possible that lottery winners go broke? If we take the dumb decisions cause poverty approach, it seems like a pretty simple explanation. And don't get me wrong, buying a bunch of houses you'll never live in and cars you'll never drive certainly doesn't help. But why buy that stuff in the first place? Not every lottery winner goes broke, but what can we observe from the ones who do? Well, let's start with something obvious that a lot of people don't like to talk about, at least not positively or try to understand it. It's that poor people play the lottery a lot more than anyone else. Because, if you look at this like someone who's never experienced chronic poverty, it doesn't really make sense. Because poor people should be saving every dollar they have, right? Well, you're not wrong, but when you live every day of life simply trying to make it to the next, long-term planning just isn't a thing for you. You're just trying to make it to the end of the week, and in some cases, to the end of the day. So why not spend a few bucks on the lottery and give yourself some hope of winning? Keep that in mind as it will become highly relevant in the next few moments. We now know that poverty also triggers some depressing long-term changes in your brain. When you're poor, the limbic system, part of the brain responsible for behavioral and emotional responses, is constantly sending fear and stress signals to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's been receiving a lot of attention in feel-good pop psychology for being the final part of the brain to mature and not doing so until you're almost 30 years old. There are lots of implications of this that are simultaneously related to and beyond the scope of this video. But the biggest one got my cousin released after a prison sentence of 33 years. He served for a life sentence or is part of a life sentence for murder. Leave me a comment if you want me to make a video about how my feelings on this go back and forth, because I think the justice system got it both wrong and right at the same time. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision making and planning. The constant stress of poverty causes it to shrink slightly, making a person less able to solve problems, set goals, and complete tasks most efficiently. And I take it that you already see where this is going. But in case you haven't, here's some more data for you. A set of experiments conducted by Andrew Shaw, an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Business School, demonstrated how this effect can have an outcome. Shaw studied the impacts of scarcity on decision-making by using a series of games in which participants were paid based on their performance. In each study, some participants received abundant resources to play the game, while others received limited resources. In some studies, players could borrow extra resources at an interest rate. Shaw found that the games took on greater urgency for people with fewer resources. These participants became more focused on the task at hand and made the best use of their scarce resources, but this added focus came at a price, including mental fatigue, costly borrowing decisions, and overall poorer performance than their richer counterparts. Shaw examined how financial scarcity influenced people's decision-making and performance in games throughout the experimental design like this. For example, in a game where the goal was to knock down targets, players with only 3 shots per round spent more time aiming than those with 15 shots. This improved their performance but had downsides. When given the chance to borrow extra shots by giving up shots in the later rounds, those with fewer shots made counterproductive borrowing decisions that hurt overall performance. While these experimental games are not the same as real-life poverty, they capture the main problem of growing up and being poor. Decisions considered routine by the affluent can take on much greater urgency for the poor. This added urgency can lead to poor choices in other matters by monopolizing attention and draining cognitive resources. It's not that people with money make many more good financial decisions than poor people. In fact, the research suggests that poverty forces you to make more efficient use of your resources, which can, in the short term, lead to higher decision quality. The problem is that when poor people make the wrong decision, they suffer greater consequences. When I was in my early 20s, a few years after I squandered the life insurance and Social Security windfall in a way that only a poor person could, I got caught up in the insidious cycle of payday loans. These are loans where the only requirement is a job that can be verified. These are great in a pinch when facing a surprise, unexpected expense. But the interest rates are exorbitant. I had more than a few loans with a greater than 20% interest rate. The type of person who needs a $500 payday loan to cover a sudden emergency doesn't have $600 to pay back. I was that type of person, so I did the most obvious thing when it came to paying them back. I took out another payday loan to help me when I fell behind on the first. And when I fell behind on that one, I took out another one. This vicious cycle continued until I closed the bank account the companies were taking their payments from and heavily screened my phone calls over the next few years as I paid them back on my own time. Fortunately, the barely legal nature of these companies makes it so they can't report a delinquency to credit bureaus. This seems fitting as these places disproportionately target low-income populations. I always tell you that you're in a low-income area if you see a liquor store, pawn shop, and a payday loan building all next to each other. Shaw observed this type of counterproductive borrowing decision in the experiments. When you're poor, survival is the highest priority. You either make decisions that ignore the long term so you can make it to payday, or survival mode shuts down your ability to intelligently handle immediate problems. All of this research explains why we make these short-sighted decisions while under the duress of poverty. And people are quick to look at research like this and propose a simple solution. Give people money so they stop feeling the stress of scarcity, and with a little financial education, we can eradicate poverty. However, if this were true, then how do we explain the lottery winners and professional athletes and musicians who go broke after the immense wealth they had? And how do we explain what I did with my $55,000 life insurance money? Scarcity mindset doesn't instantly change if you become suddenly flush with cash. If your brain has been dealing with the stress of being poor for decades, the damage your prefrontal cortex took doesn't just undo itself any faster than your body drops all the fat you put on because you ate an apple instead of cookies and went for a run one day. The longer you're poor, the worse you'll be with money if you ever make it. And this has also been proven. By analyzing the tax returns covering the U.S. population from 1996 to 2012, and then evaluating the tax returns of their children, it was found that the more money your parents made, the more likely you were to be employed at age 30 and the higher your income would be. While I think it is notable, or what I think is notable about this relationship, is that they evaluated the children at age 30. At that age, this means that whatever the economic status you had as a child is still the economic status you've had for 60%, the majority of your life. Given that poverty changes your brain and the longer you're poor, the more extensive those changes are, it's no wonder the children of the poor are more likely to repeat the same habits as their parents. Now on to my mother. In 2018, she was in a nasty car accident that was nearly the end of her. But fortunately, she made it. The driver was at fault, and she ultimately won a $150,000 settlement. At the time, my mom was living on a fixed income, and her life was more or less good on $2,500 a month. I used to tell her that getting into that accident was the best thing to ever happen to her, like she would never have to worry about money again because of the lump sum and the fixed income she was already living fine on. Well, my mom died the week before Christmas in 2021. My sister and I assumed that she had a bunch of money left because there was no possible way she spent even half of that $150K, given that she was on a fixed income beforehand and had purchased nothing extravagant, she didn't take any trips, and hadn't really shown any signs of spending it. My sister spent a lot more time with my mom than I did, and she was positive that she hadn't bought anything crazy. Well, my sister was wrong. My mom had bought multiple dish sets she had never opened, clothes she never wore, and furniture she never assembled. She had given relatives money, put money on my cousin's books who was serving a 24-year drug conviction, and was paying many of my sister's bills. However, the biggest expenses were daily DoorDash and Uber Eats purchases for every meal and lottery tickets. Not only was she out of money, but she had racked up credit card debt. My mom spent the final 3 months of her life in a hospital, but if she had recovered, she would have been in a worse financial position than she was in before the accident. Giving people more money will never fix poverty if they still see the world as a poor person. Something I never understood growing up was how people had been living in the projects for 2 and 3 generations. I knew a lot of kids whose grandmothers lived down the street and were still in the projects after all these years. And everything we've talked about is why this happens. Now, in this video here, I talk about another aspect of living in the projects that's even more debilitating than poverty. Watch this if you want to know what life is like if you live next to, how do we say this to avoid YouTube slapping the yellow dollar sign on me, substance users and substance dealers.